Is Qorsho Hassan, who is an educator, researcher, and community organizer. She served as a classroom teacher for 10 years, and in 2020 was named the Minnesota Teacher of the Year, mashallah. Mashallah, tabarakallah. Qorsho is the artist and a co-author behind the exhibit and book Urur Dehad, Community in Between, which presents color portraits, first-person video stories, and written narratives of Somalis living in Columbus, Ohio. She's a strong advocate for educational equity. If you've been paying attention, you know that, and amplifying student voice and agency. Qorsho serves on the board of 826 MSP, a creative writing and tutoring nonprofit in the Twin Cities, and serves as a lead consultant for Thrive Ed, a nonprofit that is designing the first student-led school in Minnesota. She most recently taught second grade at Echo Park Elementary School. And to learn more about her journey, listen closely, and please take a look at her recent interview with Sahan Journal. Now let's welcome up Qorsho Hassan.
Assalamu alaikum. Is this on? Can you hear me? Good. I want to start off by saying that I'm a classroom teacher. I'm not a public speaker, so I'm quite nervous. And on my way here, I was thinking about how to calm my body, how to prepare to do a keynote in person. I haven't done many in person the past 2 years. And subhanAllah, just the dhikr of Allah on my tongue calmed me down, and it also prepared me to be in community with sisters who get it. I don't have to explain myself to you. You all know, you all understand, and that I know that my story will deeply resonate with you all. So the title of my keynote is The Power of Agency, Advocacy, and Attitude. I have a lot of attitude, especially in my teaching, and how I interact with my students, and how I want them to really know of themselves and their identities. And so I thought about how to bring that to this keynote and to share more about how I teach and who I teach. So a little bit about me, but a show an accent. I love my name, Qorsho. It's very old, it's very rare, and I love explaining it to people, even Somali people who don't know the meaning of it. It means plan in of Somali. I love spending time with my nephew, Suleiman, who is almost 2 years old and rocks my world every day. And he is learning words and understanding the world around him, and just has a sense of wonder and a sense of excitement that really is something that I need really in my life right now. I've been an educator for 10 years. I've taught in Ohio, Kenya, Malaysia, and now in Minnesota. And that photo, can we go back for a second? That photo actually was taken in the beginning of the school year. And there was a lot of hope and a lot of excitement in that shot. I was looking forward to a school year that I was hoping would be more ease, or have more ease, and have a little bit more predictability. And I'll talk a little bit more about how my school year went, but I just thought I would share that photo and bring some of that energy here. So something that I want you all to sit with is that we have a population of Minnesotan students who don't have reflective teachers in front of them. 33% of students in Minnesota are students of color, and only about 4.3% of the teaching force is BIPOC educators. And so something that I always ask to anyone who's listening is to think about when they first had their Black teacher or a teacher that resonated with them, looked like them, and then thinking about what impact they had on you. And then I always love bringing my students to any talk, any time that I interact with others. And it's really important for me to bring their voices and their stories and to amplify them, not speak for them. And I decided to take a little video of my second graders this school year answering the question, what does it mean to have a Black teacher?
It means that you have the same thing in common, and you share the same cultures with the teacher. It means like similar to like sharing my culture. It really feels good because that at least means that you're not the only one in the world who is African American.
It feels good, and it also feels nice to know that this school isn't racist at all, and that I have a black teacher, so that so that that one teacher of the year last year.
I like having a black teacher because I can learn about the black um, culture and community, and I like to learn of how we can make the world a better place. It means to respect the teacher and do not be racist. It means a lot to me to have a black teacher and a teacher who has the same skin color as me because she knows how it is and how it feels to go through racism. It means a lot, and he's teaching me more than just writing and stuff like racism and segregation and a lot of other things like that. It's really fun to have a black teacher, and and we have the same culture, and we celebrate Eid and Ramadan, but then we don't see each other. But I see her at school.
You do. Those are 7 and 8-year-olds that are able to articulate the impact of a black educator who understands them. And you saw that there were white students, were Hispanic students, non-Somali students represented as well. And so just thinking about the importance of having someone that is also just showing them a different perspective, giving them a different way of looking at the world is really key. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of storytelling. I'm going to go over the origins, my origins, and then talk a little bit about my educational experience, how I got to where I am, and then my why. And then I'm going to start off by saying that, you know, given this title of Minnesota Teacher of the Year has allowed me to talk to numerous stakeholders. And the most important, most powerful thing that I can do is to share my story. And I share the quote by Amira Baraka, humans don't make stories, it's stories that makes us human. It's not until we know the stories of each other that we embrace our humanity. When I know the stories of my people and my culture, that is when I become human myself. So I have a little bit of a funny beginning to my story in that both of my parents wound up in New Orleans, Louisiana, to have my sister and I without really thinking through why they chose that spot. Before my sister and I were born, my parents came to America for different reasons. My dad wanted to own a business, and my mom was interested in continuing her education. And they found each other in Virginia, fell in love, and decided that they wanted to start a family. They believed that they could have better circumstances in America. They were excited about being a part of the American dream, and were wanting to create something that was vastly different from their own experience, while instilling their, culture and their religion into their kids. And so they decided on New Orleans. And while New Orleans seems very different from Mogadishu, I've done some reflecting, and I've thought about how temperate or mild the weather or climate is in New Orleans, how there's a lot of soul food, how there's a lot of black and brown people, and just in general, a lot of history and culture, very reminiscent of Hamar or Mogadishu. And I have a photo of my sister and I on the bottom. She's holding me on her lap. Halda is her name. And I remember when we were growing up, we were constantly reminded of our roots through riwayado, through plays, through music, hiss, and various ways of connecting with who we were. My mom did a wonderful job of teaching us our proverbs. She was very, very adamant that we knew how to pray and that we connected with our Lord. And then my dad, who was like a music head, made sure that we knew our culture through riwayado, through hes, and through other means of connecting with music making. And so when both of them wanted to create a family, they didn't think about all of the barriers or the stumbling blocks that they might experience. And they also didn't take into account the civil war that would happen in Somalia. While juggling all of this, my father, Allah yarhamo, got into a car accident, and my mom's life completely changed. She went from having a stable partner, a loving home, to grasping at the roots to make something for her two daughters. And I remember her receiving the phone call that my dad had passed away. And now that I think of it, I was too young to remember, so I think the storytelling brought it back. But I remember her crying softly and saying to herself, just reminding herself, affirming herself that she was going to be okay, that Ilahi will take care of her. And Ilahi did, alhamdulillah. And now that I think about how she has raised us and how she's instilled us to be strong, to be independent, to be connected with our Lord, I think about how all of those values were something that created a pathway for her to get out of the struggle that she was in. She she struggled with the English language. She had a hard time acclimating into a very Western culture. And she also wanted to instill some of the skills that she knew would be helpful for her daughters to be successful. And so, alhamdulillah, now that both of her daughters, my sister's a doctor, I'm a teacher, have grown up, and now we take care of her, I see all that she has poured into us, and I don't take it for granted. And anytime I tell my story, I make sure to bring Hoya's story into it, because I'm not the woman without her. So now let's take a look at my educational experience. When I talk about how my K through 12 experience was, people are very wide-eyed. They're like, why would you return to the scene of the crime? Why would you go back to where you were harmed, where you received microaggressions, where you were racialized? And we'll get into the why in a bit. But growing up in Atlanta, when we moved all over because Somalis are nomads, but we were in a very rich and vibrant community. We were poor, but we didn't know it. Hoya did a wonderful job of making sure that we were clothed, that we were fed, and we were around kids who were of our same socioeconomic background, so I didn't feel too different. Going to school, while I didn't have teachers that looked like me, I was around my peers that spoke different languages, that wore their cultural outfits, that brought different smelling foods to school. And we all just created a really loving and vibrant community. Now, my first grade teacher, who was my introduction to K through 12 schooling, because I like to say that I'm a kindergarten dropout, I didn't make it through a full year of kindergarten, she really set a tone of I would say an uncomfortable way of engaging with the education system for me right away. Her name was Miss Pickle, and she has a very interesting name, but she had a hard time getting to know me and any other student that was like me. Her class was mostly black and brown students. However, as an older white woman, she did not want to understand any of her students. She didn't want to meet them halfway. And she decided that instead of calling me Qorsho, she would call me Q. Or sometimes she would just point at me. And I remember thinking, if this is what school is like, I want nothing to do with it. And I became known as that kid, that problematic kid, the kid that had their own island. I had my own desk in the classroom, far away from my peers, because I was disrespectful. I talked back. I spoke my own language, which was criminalized in her classroom. And I wanted to make it known that I wasn't going to take her anger or her ignorance. And because of that, I was ostracized, not only by her, but by my school, by my administrators, and I was seen as this kid who just was difficult to manage. And I'll own that I was difficult to manage. But Miss Pickle also did not grant me my basic rights. She refused for me to speak my language. She refused for me to learn my ESL courses within the classroom, within the context of how she was teaching. She always wanted to other me. And I took that and it festered. And so I remember one day at my, feeling like I was at my worst, thinking, I really dislike school, I really hate my teacher, and just asking her politely if I could go to the bathroom. And she refused. She said, no, we're learning right now. And I pleaded, I was like, it's an emergency, I really have to go. And she wouldn't let me. And so I peed right then and there in the classroom. And I remember thinking, wow, this is really humiliating, but also I have the right to use the bathroom just like every other student in the classroom. And from then on, both my second grade and my third grade experiences were similar in that I had a really hard time connecting with my white teachers. I had a really hard time understanding the content that was being taught to me, and I had a really hard time connecting. But I was really social. I was very much into building connections with my peers and speaking the English language and learning it, and to a point where I was exceeding all of the language skills that I needed to be, and I was exited out of ESL. Despite that, I still didn't love school. Despite starting to learn how to read and engaging with content better, I still struggled to get out of bed and still struggled to put on my backpack. And my mom every morning would tell me, today is going to be different, today is going to be different. And I would just listen to her, but know in my head, no, it's not true, until fourth grade. Fourth grade turned out to be my transformative year. I had a teacher named Miss Fulmer who, from the first day, asked me how to pronounce my name. She said, you're going to write it down on a piece of paper as best as you can. You're going to repeat it until I get it right. And I remember thinking, she cares. She's taking the time to actually listen to me and hear me, and she's actually wanting to pronounce my very challenging name correctly. And then from then on, I started to build connections with her. She would ask me what I ate at home. She would ask me what I love to do with my family, or what my holidays were. She would even ask me how to say certain words in Arabic or Somali. And I began to feel seen in her classroom. I began to love going to school and love learning and exploring, to a point where I was not only exiting ESL, but I was also meeting my fourth grade markers and indicators, and I was on the path to being grade level, and it was because of her impact. She wasn't a teacher of color. She was merely a white teacher who was making sure she was connecting with her black and brown students. She was loving on us while having high expectations, and she was also making sure that she was bringing forth connections to her students that they would learn from, that they would connect with, and that they would understand deeply. And because of that, I carry Ms. Fulmer's experience and impact with me now 20 plus years later as a teacher. The way she was calm, the ways that she would listen and de-escalate without getting upset or thinking about how behaviors from students who are traumatized were more of a story or more of telling us how they're going through difficulty in their lives rather than they're just being bad or they're just being naughty, right? She was taking the time to care, and that spoke to me. And from that fourth grade experience, I went on this really high trajectory of loving school, loving reading really, and making really a bigger impact within my educational understanding of how I could use all of the content that I was learning to be a better person, to be a better human, and to be a community builder. Something that Hoya instilled in my sister and I was to make sure that we weren't just being successful for our family. We were being successful for our community, whether it's our community here in the US, in the diaspora, or back home. And then I had an interesting experience when we moved to Ohio. So from 5th grade onward, my family and I decided to move to Hilliard, Ohio, which is a very suburban, very white city, full of a lot of cornrows and just farmers and something that I just really wasn't used to. And it took a moment for my sister and I to gather our bearings because We went from an all black and brown school to being the only black and brown students in our school, and not realizing the impact that that would have on us. On top of that, also going through post 9/11, being racialized, being seen as the token if we were in AP or honors classes, and being seen as the exemplary students while not really seeing us for who we are, our multidimensionalness, our multifacetedness. And so something that I remembered experiencing in Hilliard was a lot of my white teachers ignoring the racialized experiences that I was going through. They would either pretend to not listen, or sometimes they would participate, but I felt very othered. And I felt like I was always the target whenever conversations about Israel would come up, or terrorism, or anything to do with 9/11. And it was always that Muslim girl, that black Muslim girl with a jilbab that could answer that question, or that we should all stare at. And my sister and I started to resent our high school experience, our middle school experience in this suburb. But then we realized that we wanted better, so we were trying our best to think about higher education, thinking about the next step, thinking about what lies ahead. So my sister decided to go into medicine. She really wanted to be a contributor in that facet, and I decided to check out education. And the big reason for that is because I got this opportunity to do a Fulbright in Malaysia, where I got to teach Chinese, Malay, and Indian students for a year. And while I was very young and naive, I learned a lot about myself. I learned how to advocate for myself, how to realize and recognize anti-blackness. I learned how to be a better human for all of my students, and acknowledge when I made a mistake instead of calling the student out on my mistake. And I learned that education was my calling. And prior to my Fulbright experience, I had worked at a CDC, a child care center in Columbus. And it was mostly for intercity students, black and brown students, who were learning how to read and were getting those emergent literacy skills. And I remember just being a brand new teacher, having really little to no practical skills, just kind of wanting to impact the students in the best way that I knew. And I was really doubting myself. I was unsure if I knew how to teach, if I knew what I was doing was right. And immediately, I noticed students were gravitating towards me. They were excited to be with me. They were excited to learn and read and be in community with students that were around me. And I realized then that I had a gift of being with kids and learning and loving them, and seeing them for who they truly are. And so now that I think about my why, I think about how the students that I've impacted, the students that I work for, that I'm in service of, are in constant need of liberation. They're in constant need of joy, and they're in constant need of advocacy. They are powerful. They are innately aware or in tuned of their power, but are often not made to realize their power in the regular standard K through 12 classroom. And so I think about this quote by Toni Morrison, the function of freedom is to free someone else. I went back to the crime scene so that I could be who I needed when I was a kid. And the beauty of being around students that look like me, that speak the same language, that have the same struggles, that experience anti-blackness and anti-immigration, is that we get each other right away. I do a little bit of community building, but I don't need to do a whole lot, because there's that immediate trust and we understand each other. And from then, we build this level of excellency where they know their power, they're aware of their capability, and then they realize that they're brilliant, and they are able to overcome any obstacles in their way. So the beauty of also being a Black teacher is that not only am I a window for those students who have never had a Black teacher, who are not Black, who need that different exposure, that different perspective, but I'm also a mirror for those students who've never had a teacher that looks like them, or who understands them, or who believes them right away. And so I've kind of put together a few photos that really exemplified the idea of windows and mirrors. This concept was brought by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. And she talks about how in multicultural literature, students connect really well with stories about their culture, about their race and their identity. And so here are a few photos. The first one is a Somali elder who is teaching my fifth graders how to weave. And these elders came with very minimal English, and so they were using a lot of sign language, a lot of nonverbal skills, and they were able to teach 35 fifth graders how to weave bracelets, which was miraculous. And they gave them these gifts of the Somali culture and the powerful beauty of weaving. And years later, my students still wear them, and they send me pictures of those bracelets that they still have on to recall that memory and to also recall just being a window for them. I also think about how my students who look like me really benefit from having someone that understands them, that reflects them, and that holds them to high expectations as well, right? And so the student that's wearing the matching hijab with me on the top was taught in Kenya for a couple years. And so the first day of fifth grade, she was really overwhelmed and was really nervous and scared about what her fifth grade year would look like, how it would be dramatically different from learning in Kenya. And I remember just calming her, telling her, oh wow, like we're wearing the same color hijab, let's take a selfie. And then watching all of her worries melt away. And she had a phenomenal year. She improved by 5 to 6 reading levels and became a star student, all because I believed in her, but more importantly, she believed in herself. And then something that I really enjoy doing is bring community to the classroom. I love bringing leaders and mentors and connectors, whether it's through a read aloud, whether it's through posters, whether it's a classroom visit. I want my students to know how they can be advocates for themselves, how they can see themselves in different professions, and see themselves reflected in a world that is sometimes cruel and unrelenting towards them. Here are a few more photos. The middle photo is a project that I had my students take part in. They were looking at different leaders within the Somali community and writing what questions and thoughts and ideas that they had for them, given the stories that they shared with us. I also have a photo to the far right of a little field trip experience that I provided for one of my third graders. He is really interested in design, and I had a friend who is in design work, and so I took him over to his studio, and they had an hour-long session of creating different anime and characters, and years later, that student remarks on how important and impactful that was, and now he's taking courses in high school to further pursue that passion and hopefully to become it in the future. So I've taught in Minnesota for 5 years. I like to say that I'm very recent to this state as much as I can, just because I am still getting used to the Minnesota nice here. It's very fascinating to me that it's called Minnesota nice when it's very passive aggressive, and it's also very anti-confrontational. And I'm the exact opposite of that. My mother raised me to speak my truth and to share my thoughts right away. And something that I have yet to get used to, and I probably won't get used to, is how oftentimes, particularly white Minnesotans in this state, avoid conflict. And the beauty of being a black teacher is that I always have my students to go back to. They are my why. So anytime that I'm advocating or amplifying their voices, I always go back to how their stories matter, and if they're not at the table, I will bring their stories to the table. And while Minnesota schools are considered the best in the nation, they are actually the worst for students of color. And the same could be said for teachers of color as well. So on August 6, 2020, I was named Minnesota Teacher of the Year, and I still reflect on that moment, the fear that I had, just the shock of it all. I was really not expecting to be named, but I also knew that it was time. The state had seen many Teachers of the Year who were of the same background, who were sharing the same stories, and it was time for a black Muslima to take that title. And because of that title, I received what I call white lash right away. I think as soon as media outlets were sharing the news of my naming, I was receiving emails, comments, and later on phone calls and threatening visits to my school about the fact that I was named Minnesota Teacher of the Year. And a lot of this was fear. It was fear of having someone who normally their stories or their voices would be silenced being amplified at such a wide level. And I knew that, but at that moment I was feeling doubtful that it was because I wasn't ready. And I was receiving that because maybe it wasn't a right fit for me. But as time grew, I realized that it was meant for me. Ilahi willed it, and I've done a lot of work because of this title, and I've changed a lot of narratives both within schools and out of schools because of my advocacy. And I've really stuck through with a platform of speaking about anti-racism, anti-oppression work, and really pushing teachers, and especially white teachers, to do the work. And not to call it bias work or implicit bias work, but actually call the work what it is. And the idea of being this black Muslima who speaks to not only teachers at her level, but also stakeholders like the governor, and then later on the President of the United States, has been really powerful in that I've been able to bring forth stories from my students, from my communities that have always been there, but just haven't been amplified. And I don't take that for granted. Every moment that I'm able to share my story, I incorporate my students and my community into it as well. And the beauty of also being a black educator is you have this ability, this power, I like to call it a superpower, of building a coalition of allies, disruptors, and change makers. The fear that I was experiencing when I was named wasn't because I didn't think I was ready. It wasn't because I wasn't ready. I was. It was white supremacist ideals seeping into my mind. I was thinking that I didn't have the opportunity or I didn't have the willpower to go through the struggles that I did. And while I did struggle, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, I also persevered and I came up at the other side, taking care of myself and valuing my humanity as well as the humanity of my students. And so I shared a few photos of what 2020 looked like for me. It looked like speaking up and speaking out, reminding my students, especially my white students, of their power and their privilege to combat racism, and then reminding my students of color that they are worthy, that they are powerful, innately so, and then making sure that my students were the ones speaking out. So you can see in the far right corner, my student Nashad speaking up at a protest, at a rally, to basically remind teachers that the importance of anti-racist work, and making sure that they are showing up for all of their students, especially their black and brown students. I've also been reading, and I've always read banned books, but one banned book that got a lot of attention was Something Happened in Our Town. I read this book to my fourth graders 2 years ago, and it created somewhat of a storm, a media storm, in that there was a lot of anger by white supremacists as to why I read a story that complicated narratives of the relationship between police and community. And I continue to read banned books because I know the importance of bringing those narratives to my students who need to see and understand that they're not the only ones struggling. They're not the only ones experiencing anti-blackness or racism or anti-oppression, and then what to do in light of it. And then I'll talk a little bit about the reality of being a black educator. While this state is known for being Minnesota nice and affluent and progressive, it's also incredibly harmful for teachers of color. We often have to take on the cultural tax or the invisible tax of answering questions, of being the liaison between conflicts between students of color and their teachers. There's also the struggle to show up as our authentic selves because you have to conform, right, to a certain whiteness. And then, you know, dealing with the cold, unwelcoming Minnesota nice has not been fun. And then realizing that failure is manufactured. Oftentimes, our students of color are said to be failing, right? But the system is actually failing them. It's not providing them opportunities to succeed. It's not providing them a curriculum that is representative. And so that failure is manufactured. And then feeling invisible, undervalued, underrepresented, dismissed whenever we bring up our concerns, whenever we advocate for ourselves or for our students. And then there's often little agency. We have little control over what happens outside of our classrooms and how it impacts the rest of the school. There's also the racial battle fatigue, where we're constantly fighting systems within both in the classroom and then outside of the classroom. An example would be a white student of mine used the N-word in the classroom, and I had to manage that rather than a white admin or an administrator who had more power. And then we have last in, first out. This is called LIFO. It's the tenure track system in this state that prevents really teachers of color from matriculating, from becoming tenured, because oftentimes we are the brand new teachers within the districts. In fact, I was, when I was given the title, or when I was named finalist for Teacher of the Year, I was actually let go by the district that I was working at because of this policy. And so this summer, I took it upon myself to really do some healing, to do some inner work. It's been incredibly hard to announce that I'm stepping away from teaching, but I think it's been really important to highlight that no job is worth your mental health. And while I'm reemerging and rediscovering who I am, because I've given a lot of my identity to teaching, I've also so valued sharing my story, and there's power in that. And so I took it upon myself to share my story with Becky, who works at the Sahan Journal, and sharing why I decided to step away from teaching, why it's no longer fulfilling for me, and how it's in fact harming me and harming my students as well. And I didn't know it then, but when I decided to step away from teaching, I was making sure that my students knew that I was protecting myself, that I was loving myself and putting myself first, something that I think is really important to model, and that I was also sending a message to administrators that district mismanagement and societal neglect is not my problem. It's not for me to handle. It's not for teachers to handle. That is for policymakers, that is for legislators, and that's for people who get a higher pay grade, who make those decisions for schools. While I'm stepping away from teaching in the classroom, I also realize that I will always be a teacher, right? I'm always going to impact students, impact other teachers through my advocacy. Whenever I speak, I make sure to share what I'm learning, and also to share that I am always a learner. I do not have anything figured out, despite the title. I am not the best teacher, right? I'm still learning and realizing how to not inflict harm on my students. I also pray, inshallah, while the system took a lot out of me, that it doesn't take away my gift, it doesn't take away my humanity, because that is what makes me who I am. So I share a few of these tidbits, knowing that I'm still doing this work, and I am very vulnerable in that. But I also think it's a way for us to prioritize ourselves, who we are. Our time is money. Our mental health, our whole being, right, needs to be protected from the capitalistic white supremacist system that we're living under. And in order to do that, you need to make sure that you are elevating yourself, that you are setting boundaries, that you are understanding yourself and unlearning your biases, and learning how to be unapologetic no matter what. Not just with the right people, but with all people. And I think it's also important to realize that elevating yourself means you're elevating others around you. So you're finding ways to communicate with your community and finding ways to do some engagement work through volunteering, participating, going into classrooms, reading a book to those students, participating in anti-oppression work, and really thinking about how to build power and elevate your voice, not just for yourself, but for those around you as well. And I'm gonna share one of my favorite proverbs. And it really speaks to me because this is something that Hoya, my mother, instilled in my sister and I think it's kind of innate within us as well. And it's, if you close your mouth from justice, your chest would tear up, which means you can't hide justice forever. Someone help me out. Sorry, I was born in America. I'm trying my best. But basically, it will explode from your chest. You can't hide injustice. Speak up whenever you see wrong being done, no matter what the implications are. And then choosing yourself. This is really hard for a teacher to do. We are like the backbone of selfless work. But it's really important to sit with the fact that you are your greatest asset, and you need to do anything to protect yourself by any means necessary. So being authentically you, make sure that you are honoring your identity, your culture, your religion, your values. Establish boundaries, knowing when to say no and being okay with that. I think it's really important that we set boundaries, especially as Black Muslim women. We are constantly run over. We are given more than we can handle because we're expected to handle that. But say no. Do not be a token, even when tokenized. Really important for us to know that a single narrative is not going to save our humanity or our community. Find your people and create spaces that are exclusively for you all. And then last but not least, affirm yourself even when you're most doubtful. I'm gonna try not to tear up when I share this. The past 2 years have been really hard on me. My mental health has taken a lot of hits. I've been depressed, I've been on antidepressants, and while it's been really hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel, something that I realized that I was doing in the classroom was I was constantly affirming my students all the time, even when they were feeling at their lowest. And I didn't realize that I could have used those affirmations too. So shout out to Anissa Haji. She created these wonderful affirmation cards, and I would read them to myself. I would remind myself of my power, and I would understand more about who I am when I affirm myself. So thank you, Anissa. Love you too. Jazakallah khairan. Thank you so much for having me as your keynote speaker. Sorry, I was nervous, but I really appreciate the space that you all provided for me to be vulnerable and authentic and me, and I'm really proud to be here. Thank you.